everyone. Today I'm going to be looking at rock art conservation with a focus on Africa, and more specifically Southern Africa. I will discuss rock art conservation both in terms of site management and remedial interventions. As a side note, I have purposely used this panel of eland from the Eastern Cape Drakensberg as the background. In the rest of the presentation, you will be seeing more distressing instances of conservation problems, so I thought it would be nice to start off with an image of a site that is in a good state of preservation, with few conservation issues. Rock art is a transitory form of artistic expression, which, with the eradication of the culture of the people who created it, is on its way to extinction. Africa is home to many thousands of rock engravings and painting sites, and although conservation attempts will ultimately fail, there is still much we can do to help preserve this fragile heritage for future generations. Africa is a large and varied continent with 54 different countries. Heritage legislations and conservation practices differ from country to country, and it is impossible to do justice to all these differences. But it is possible to cover broad conservation problems, principles, and point to possible solutions. For many people, the word conservation or conservator brings up images of someone in a lab restoring or stabilizing an object. And rock art conservation conjures up images such as graffiti removal project with Jeanette Deacon in KwaZulu-Natal. Conservation in European societies has in the past been mostly concerned with preserving physical sites and objects. During the latter half of the 20th century, conservation has developed into a distinct profession following scientific principles to conserve objects, monuments, and rock art sites. This is conservation in the narrow sense. It is seen as the province of the conservator alone, where the nature and condition of objects or sites are assessed and conservation measures put in place to rectify problems, improve the condition, or at least prevent further deterioration of the site. And it is seen as the conservator's responsibility to preserve the authenticity of the object or site. But this view is problematic as it tends to freeze a site in a predetermined, authentic, in inverted commas, time as determined by the conservator. Over the last few decades, the idea of rock art conservation and conservation in general has shifted from a focus on the physicality of paintings or engravings to a broader approach that looks at the wider meanings that make a site important. This means considering both the tangible and intangible significances of a site. Here, although I do look at some remedial interventions of specialist conservators, I take a broader view of conservation, which can be called consultative conservation. In this image, Ntabiseng Mokoena and Sam Chalice are addressing some of the local community in the Matatiele area in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. The idea with consultative conservation is to avoid the conventional top-down approaches to heritage management and conservation and put forward ideas for a sustainable African conservation that moves away from Eurocentric ideas and puts local community participation on an equal footing to the conservators and heritage managers, to ensure rock art sites survive into the future. Here, the work of the conservator needs to be viewed in the context as one voice amongst many. Conservation needs to be a dialogue and negotiation between all whom the site has meaning. In this dialogue, the future users also play a role, and in this case it is the so-called experts, heritage practitioners, and academics who will speak for them. But their needs must not outweigh those for whom the site is part of their belief systems, gives them economic benefit, etc. We need to understand how all the stakeholders can work together for the benefit of the site or sites in question. Conservation is not just about making sure the artifact or rock art image is protected, but it is also about making sure that the intangible heritage is conserved and the landscape around the site managed properly. Thus, we need to move away from the past, where the conservation was performed for the sake of the object or site. Rather, conservation should be performed for the sake of the people for whom the site or object performs a function, be it tangible or intangible. Heritage management and conservation in Africa is entangled with its colonial past. Africa was parceled up by European powers, and the decisions on which heritage to protect and what was conserved differed considerably. But the commonality was that the values of the local people were seldom considered. Local populations were seen as objects of study rather than people who should be involved in the management and conservation of sites. Groups were moved far from their ancestral homes in the name of conservation, and these relocations created a physical and spiritual disconnect between people and heritage sites. Unfortunately, with independence, often little has changed. Many African countries continue with colonial heritage legislations, which include the forced movement of people. It is time to acknowledge the existence of alternative stories and parallel ways of understanding, utilizing, and caring for the material past. Traditional management systems are often thought to be either ineffectual or detrimental to the site's conservation, but it is through these indigenous management strategies that so many sites in Africa have survived till the present. In theory, heritage management practices have become more inclusive, with an emphasis on consultation of the local community, but all too often community engagement is just a box that is checked. Heritage and conservation practitioners enjoy professional benefits and kudos of collaborative projects and have rushed to adopt the mantra of community participation. This allows them to take the high moral ground without actually acting on community concerns. Archaeologists and heritage practitioners ignore how their conservation efforts have impacted the victims of their work, those who can no longer continue with traditional practices at the sites and often can no longer receive economic benefit from the site. An acknowledgement of this would detract from the perceived good the conservators are doing in rescuing and preserving. We need to acknowledge that in many cases, rock art sites cannot be thought of as places frozen in time, but are rather active ritual sites that are continuing to be used and continuing to evolve. It is the very fact that the sites are places of active engagement that ensures their survival. Solutions should allow for the coexistence of different approaches rather than looking for one single way of doing. Conservation strategies that are developed with a top-down approach by experts might offer the site protection through legal and administrative frameworks, but ultimately only a limited and one-sided view of the site's significance is preserved. The rock art site of Dombashawa in Zimbabwe provides an example of the problems which come with a top-down approach. The site contains many fine examples of Southern African hunter-gatherer rock art and was first designated as a national monument in 1934. Although the rock art has been the main focus of attention, the site also includes a sacred forest, and part of the rock shelter was traditionally used by local communities for rainmaking ceremonies. Part of the ceremony involved making a fire in a hole in the shelter, and there were worries that the fire would damage the rock art. Despite the official ban, ceremonies still continued, but at night. In 1985, in order to stop the perceived damage, the hole was blocked with cement. After a series of droughts in the 1990s, the site was badly vandalized with brown paint, as shown in this image. The local people thought that by obliterating the art, the inscription of the site would be reversed and rainmaking ceremonies could resume. This example shows how important it is to fully understand all the significances of the site and the value it holds for all stakeholders. Since the vandalism of the site and subsequent conservation intervention to remove the paint, there has been an ongoing dialogue between the management of the site and the local community, where their needs are now also considered. This path is much harder than the top-down management approach, but it is very important for the site's conservation. In order to decolonize rock art and heritage conservation, Western conservation ideals need to be reconceptualized in an African context. The development of a conservation plan needs to be considered in relation to how communities have been conserving the sites, as well as the inclusion of real community involvement. The decision-making process for the conservation should consider issues of negotiated authority, shared control, and informed participation in developing partnerships that provide sustainable long-term care. Objects or sites become meaningful through many mechanisms, including the academic, social, and sentimental. There can be many meanings, values, and significances to a rock art site. Deciding what is authentic, in inverted commas, is a subjective choice. For example, when more recent charcoal outlines are found on paintings or a painting has been chipped away, the authentic state is assumed to be that before this vandalism, in inverted commas, happened. The charcoal outlines are removed and the chips are retouched to make them less visible, and the more recent work is eradicated. Here is an example of some charcoal drawings found over older rock art in Malawi. Should this be removed to make the older rock art more visible? In this case, the charcoal outline is of a Nyau motif, which is often seen in the finger-painted rock art of the tradition of the area. Nyau motifs are related to a men's Nyau association, which is open to initiates only. It has been proposed that the earlier white paintings were made as part of Nyau activities, but what of the charcoal drawings? Were these done more recently as idle scribbles by those just copying the earlier designs, or are they a continuation of the beliefs in a different form? Even if they are just idle scribbles, what we might call graffiti, do we have a right to remove them because they are not authentic? In the Eastern Cape in South Africa, some of the paint is chipped away from the images to be used for medicinal purposes, specifically the red paint. Should the conservator or heritage practitioner stop people from accessing the site for this purpose? The chipping is done by those who wish to draw on the perceived power of the paint, and in a way this is a continuation of the beliefs of the hunter-gatherer people who originally made the paintings. What about when initiation practices happen in the shelters? This may result in damage from fires or touching of the paintings, but the reason the painted sites are often chosen is because of their perceived power. In these cases, conservators often aim to stop current traditions, assuming that the original rock paintings are all that is important. In doing this, they deny the truth that the paintings are actually part of a continuing tradition. If some of these practices are stopped, then the value of the site could be lost, which would have negative implications for further conservation of the site by local communities. Our choices in these situations are based on personal training and belief in what constitutes authenticity. There is no objective truth of authenticity out there. Subjectivity is part of conservation practice. We need to try and protect all traces of people in the past and present, rather than be stewards of a selectively constructed record. We need to acknowledge that conservation is context-specific, and some groups may value a site not on its conservation of the material past, but on its reworking, recycling, and even destruction. A values-based conservation strategy seeks to safeguard all the significances of a site, rather than just trying to slow down physical change. Understanding the significance of a site means looking at all the reasons that a site may be seen as valuable. Here are some of the things we need to look at. Information on the site, including its heritage status, physicality, and oral and documentary evidence. A definition as to the nature, extent, and history and development of a site. The cultural context of a site, including its current use, significance to local communities, history, etc. The importance of the site for research, and a comparative analysis with other sites in the area, highlighting the differences that make this site distinctive. All the stakeholders need to be considered, and thus trying to find the overall significance is almost impossible. There is a need to weigh up the differences between site owners, local custodians, researchers, traditional users, and the public. Rock art can be interpreted and reinterpreted in different ways by different people. The fact that contemporary indigenous readings of some rock art sites differs from a scholarly interpretation or the original image maker's intentions does not make them any less real. Before putting management and conservation practices in place, the question, why conserve, needs to be answered. How one assesses the significance and value of the site in question dictates which sites are chosen as worth conserving. Very often it is the aesthetic development and touristic potential that dictates conservation rather than the significance to the people on the ground, and this needs to change. Rock art sites in Africa are nearly all in shallow shelters or in open in the open where they are subject to two primary sources of deterioration, natural forces and anthropogenic activity. Natural deterioration involves exposure to the elements, such as rain, fluctuations in humidity and temperature, biological growth over both the art and in front of it. In this image from the Eastern Cape, you can see that it has been slowly obliterated by lichen. Animal activity and wildfires. Here you can see, also from the Eastern Cape, the tree in the shelter burnt, causing soot and spalling in the shelter. And we also get natural spalling. Animals such as baboons and dassies often rest or live on ledges above paintings, and the urine washes down, causing damage. These all contribute to the degradation of the sites. We can slow some of these processes through interventions, but ultimately there's no way of stopping natural deterioration. Human interest in rock art sites very often results in their destruction. Increased accessibility has only made the problem worse. Some of the destructive activities include scratching or writing of graffiti. But in this slide, look at the date on the graffiti from this shelter in Lesotho and think back to what I was saying earlier about significance in graffiti. There's also the problem of repainting or adding details to images, water or other liquids being splashed on the paintings to bring out the details, smoke from fires made in the shelters. Note this campfire over here made directly in front of the rock paintings, and the removal or attempted removal of painted images. In the past, slabs of painted images or whole boulders with engravings were removed, seldom by experts, and taken to institutions or private collections. The act of removal results in irreparable damage to adjacent remaining images, as well as removes the images from their context. In this picture from KwaZulu-Natal, you can see where 3 panels have been removed. They are now in the Durban Museum. But imagine all the images in between that were destroyed. Removal should only be undertaken in context where the site's destruction is otherwise assured through dam building or other such developments. Sometimes shelters are used to house animals, resulting in abrasion and soiling of the rock art. In the site in Lesotho, there's beautiful rock art on the walls, but as you can see, the site has been walled in and is used for pigs, damaging the lower areas. We must remember that localized threats such as vandalism are often small compared to the much larger threats posed by development such as dams and mining. Since much of Africa is economically depressed, it is difficult to argue for the preservation of sites when development will bring more money into an area. When one is struggling to survive, it's hard to see the long-term benefits of preserving some rock paintings. So what are some of the ways of conserving sites and their broader contexts? Unlike freestanding objects in museums or historic structures, rock art sites are an integral part of a natural, evolving and living landscape. Controlling or mitigating the natural forces of deterioration is extremely difficult at best and often unfeasible. Add to this the role these forces may play in the intangible cultural values of the site, which should also be conserved, and the task becomes near impossible. Efforts to reduce or remove anthropogenic causes of damage are more realistic, but this work is often challenged by difficult logistics, the lack of trained professional conservators, and inadequate funding. The main strategies for conservation are documentation, remedial intervention, management, and education. Documentation should be the first as well as the last action taken in any rock art conservation strategy. First, documentation of the rock art prior and after any remedial intervention is essential in order to assess the efficacy of the treatment, as well as any possible damage to the images due to the intervention methods. Second, as full as possible documentation of rock art sites should be part of any management process. Last, there are times when a site cannot be saved either from natural weathering processes or due to destruction from development. In this last case, the documentation will be all that will survive into the future and should be as thorough as possible and should include information about any local communities or groups that have an interest in the site. Local people should always be part of the documentation team, as they will often bring an insider view on the spiritual and other intangible values of the site. Photography is one of the most commonly employed methods of documenting the rock art images, and the development of digital enhancement techniques, such as in these images, means that much more detail can be obtained from these photographic images. These ones have been enhanced using D-Stretch software, and I've given a link in the references under the name of the creator, J. Harmon. Conservators and researchers also need to be aware that the documentation process itself can be destructive and take measures to mitigate this. Contact tracing of painted images can cause damage if the surface is friable, if the paint is thickly painted on the surface, or if it's done by inexperienced people. Rubbings of engraved sites can be detrimental through friction and contamination by pigments used to obtain the impressions. Taking physical casts of engravings can not only leave molding material residues behind, but can also physically weaken the surface of the rock, leaving it more susceptible to erosion. The images here are from a project to mold the huge giraffe engravings in the Sahara Desert in present-day Niger. I do not have details of the specifics of this project, but chose these photos to illustrate how invasive this process is, with many opportunities for damage. As a side note, the quote I give you at the end of the talk as a possible discussion piece was written in the context of this site. Good documentation can also be used in the digital restoration of a site. Jeff Guy and Justine Winches detail the digital restoration of Good Hope Shelter in the Maluti Drakensberg. The site is badly damaged, as can be seen in the top two images. Many of the images were traced in the 1950s by Patricia Vinicum and can no longer be seen today. These tracings were digitally draped over the rock surface in their original places, reinserting the images into the rock shelter. This method of restoration is, while not perfect, one way of restoring a site without physical intervention and the associated problems of restoration. Here's the fully digitally restored shelter. Intervention can take a very basic form, which could include removing introduced vegetation from near the rock art, providing other places for domestic animal enclosures, and limiting access through keeping the site's whereabouts secret, unless they are properly managed. More invasive methods of intervention need a specialist conservator and can result in severe damage to the art if not done correctly. Here are some examples of some interventions. This is the before image of a small antelope from a rock art shelter in South Africa. It is covered in a white precipitate. And here's the image after the precipitate has been removed. The following three sets of images are the before and after of images showing graffiti removal in Kenya. Graffiti removal is not a simple task and should only be undertaken by a trained professional. With the lack of professionally trained conservators in Africa specializing in rock art, those involved in rock art conservation are often left to rely on becoming self-taught through literature or exploration of online resources. But understanding the correct methodology and learning about the appropriate materials is only part of the challenge. Developing the technique and application of the methodology and materials is equally important. With more invasive interventions, great care has to be taken to include a program for long-term follow-up of the measures taken. For example, there is a site in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa where drip lines were installed in the 1970s to supposedly protect the paintings from damage. Lacking regular maintenance, the drip lines are broken apart, and the break in the drip line is now concentrating the water flow over the paintings, causing more damage than the original problem. Note in these top two examples how the drip lines have remained intact and have mitigated some of the original damage, but have created new issues of water flow. In these two examples, the drip lines are broken and are now concentrating the flow onto the images, which you can no longer see. Management of a site should provide a plan for protection, conservation, use, and enhancement of the site. It should be specific to each site, as the possibilities, constraints, and character need to be taken into account. The plan is usually laid out in a management plan document, which is periodically reviewed as the site evolves. The challenge for heritage practitioners is to balance all the competing demands of a variety of stakeholders, including the local community, national interests, professional requirements, and global economics. Site management is a huge and complex task in itself, so here I'll just give some pointers on managing sites for conservation following this flow chart. Once the environmental and historical background is in place, site assessment needs to be done. This should look at the significance, management issues, and condition. When assessing significance, one needs to take into consideration all the factors I mentioned earlier about local communities. This should not take the form, as so often happens, of a meeting with the local community where promises are made and then their concerns are ignored, while the heritage manager leaves feeling good they have checked that box. Real consultation and working together is needed. The next part of the plan needs to recommend a management strategy, which should include conservation measures, visitor strategies, and marketing. The site needs regular monitoring and reassessment, which might inform on modifications to the original strategy. Public awareness and education is needed for integrated management systems to work. An application of all values of the site and the site's importance to society will promote an understanding of why sites should be conserved. But heritage managers need to be aware that education is not a one-way top-down process. Communities may need to be made aware of the values of other aspects of the site, but heritage managers can also learn from local communities. It is not only education around the significance of the site that is needed, but information as to exactly what researchers and heritage practitioners are doing at the site. In Tanzania, uncontrolled digging at many rock art sites was followed by visits by researchers. Often when local people saw outsiders and foreigners in particular taking an interest in the site, they concluded that they must be looking for something valuable like treasure, and thus decided to dig. Thus there's a suggestion that education around archaeology should be part of the school curriculum from primary school onwards. In these photos from the Mweni area in KwaZulu-Natal, Jeremy Holman is talking to a group of high school learners in the area. And in the second photo, an elder from the Tonyelane Valley is speaking to young shepherds about the need to conserve rock art. Last, there's an urgent need for specialized conservators in most African countries. People, including local community members, should be skilled to at least a conservation technician level. Unfortunately, funding for training, and more importantly, funding to employ the trained technicians is seldom available. In conclusion, we need to acknowledge and work towards undoing the injustices, coercions, and exploitations of past conservation practices, both in practice and legislation. Rather than seeing our way of doing things as best practice, we need to acknowledge that local conservation practices have worked for centuries and can continue to work. We need to get out of our privileged mindset and understand that our moral and scientific grounds for certain practices are often based on romantic notions of a past frozen in time, rather than something that belongs to all and is continually negotiated in the present. Conservation is not easy, but with hard work it can be done successfully to the benefit of all concerned. I've given a choice of 2 activities for you to do. You can choose either one, either the quote below or the image on the next page. And what I would like you to do is write a short piece, 1 to 2 paragraphs long, and between 1 and 200 words, and discuss either the quote or the image with reference to the conservation issues that have been highlighted in this talk. Here's the image. And this is the prize for the winning entry, sponsored by the KwaZulu-Natal Museum. The 2 books are by Garth Sampson. one has just been published recently, the other was published in 2018, and we're giving you a copy of last year's Southern African Humanities Journal, as well as a few goodies from the museum. Here's a reference list and some further readings. I've tried to highlight in bold the readings which are more easily accessible either on ResearchGate or JSTOR, but hopefully some of the others you can find in your university library. Connectivity issues meant that I couldn't be interviewed directly, answer questions directly to the panel. So they've sent me the questions here, which I'm going to try answer now. So the first question, what are some of the issues with sustainable tourism associated with South African rock art and heritage sites? This is a huge question, so I'll just go into it very briefly. But one of the main problems is, I think, is that funding often is seen is only given in the short term. And often guides are trained, but there isn't funding to pay them. So for example, a lot of the Drakensberg sites, the guides were trained and then their income was supposed to be from tourists, but there was no marketing and very few tourists came. And so therefore they found other jobs because it just wasn't enough to sustain them. And this is a kind of catch-22 situation, because then you have guides who are not properly trained, who are not giving interesting or correct information to visitors, and visitors don't find the sites interesting and don't want to come back or spread the words or to other people or visit other sites. I think there are ways of getting around this, but unfortunately it does mean long-term funding of these sites. We can't expect them to be self-sustaining. If you look in other parts of the world, a lot of these sites have quite a lot of government funding, rock art sites. The second question, how significant is training local guides and including local members in the research and publication process? Does this fall within conservation and preservation initiatives associated with heritage? If not, should it? Okay, I mentioned the training of local guides above, but I do think local people need to be included, and this actually brings about a bigger issue in the publication process, not of the problems, but of actually how people go about putting together management plans. So it's normally done as an overall view, and someone might reference a management plan here or there, but very seldom are there publications really looking at on the ground how this consultative process worked, how people have gone around about writing these plans. And I think that would actually be something interesting, especially if it could come from both sides, from both the local people and how they experience the process, as well as the heritage managers. So yeah, I think it should be. And I do think the more involved people feel and the more of a vested interest people have, the more likely sites are going to be preserved. Your third question, what is often described as vandalism or destruction of sites by present-day individuals or groups are associated with negative connotations, as you've explained. However, these actions still represent human behavior and the active creation of history that may represent current social, cultural, or socio-economic and or socio-political dynamics. How does one navigate this as a researcher or conservator, and should we consider this part of the site's story? I think in this case, every site is different. And also the graffiti or the vandalism, why was it done? It can be part of the site story, but we can still remove it with images of what it looked like before. If the graffiti is old, it definitely needs to be recorded. But we also need to think that any graffiti made now will one day be old in the future. And so I think we have to look at each site on an individual level and look at the dynamics, the different stakeholders, and why we're conserving that site. If our prime purpose for conserving the site is to educate the public about rock art and show them a beautiful site, then we would want to maybe remove all the graffiti. Because it has been shown that graffiti attracts graffiti. So once you get 1 or 2 bits of graffiti, you are likely to get a lot more. And the last question, could digitizing of rock art become the more practical solution for conservation of these sites as opposed to continuously trying to physically conserve and protect sites? I think there's no way we can conserve, I mean, with all the thousands of sites just in South Africa alone, we can't conserve and protect all of them. So digitizing them is a priority. Getting out there and recording as many sites as we can. But then, along with this, I still think there are things that we can do to conserve the sites. Even if it's just very basic, like done in some of these KwaZulu-Natal sites, just making sure the vegetation is not near the paintings so that when forest fires happen, the site's not damaged, or that there's some sort of a barrier to stop animals rubbing against the side of the sites, or preventing members of the public knowing where the sites are if they don't have any management, because unfortunately a lot of people, especially when they don't know what the rock art is about, come and feel the need to just deface it. So thank you so much for listening, and good luck. Bye.